In today's video, I want to give you guys a little bit of an opinion, and my opinion on braid to leaders. Now, there's a lot of anglers and there's a lot of debate around whether you should go straight fluoro, straight mono, straight one top of line, or you should go braid to a leader. And for me, I kind of mix and match both straight mono or fluoro and braid to leaders. And so in today's video, I'm going to talk to you guys about the scenarios in which I use both and kind of my opinion on why I don't use braid to leaders in certain scenarios, but I do in others. Now, like I said, braid to leaders is something that a lot of people do. A lot of people believe it helps them to get a better hook set into the fish. It helps them to not use as much, like line material. Like if you use a fluorocarbon, you retie a bunch or you get a backlash, eventually you're gonna have to replace all that line. And so braid allows you to use a minimal amount of line for a long period of time. I mean, you put braid on a reel, and as long as you don't use a whole bunch of it or bird nest it bad enough, you gotta cut it out. I mean, I've got braid on some of my reels that are 2, 3, 4 years old. And so it just helps to use less line, be a little bit more affordable. But for me, what I've found is that I don't trust a braid to fluorocarbon or monofilament leader when I'm using casting gear and I'm using a heavy rod. Now, a lot of that comes back to the fact that I set the hook really hard. I'm one of those slackliners. I'm like G-Man himself. Like I'm slackliner. I like to hit them hard. Now, yeah, I could adjust how I fish, but I've been fishing this way for 30 years and I don't want to adjust how I fish. I like to hit them hard. And so for me, a straight fluorocarbon or a straight braid with no leader on it is the way that I am going to fish, just because I don't trust even the best of leader knots when it comes to how I actually set the hook. And I think too, it kind of comes back to the gear that you use as well. Like, if you're fishing a 710 extra heavy rod with a 50-pound braid to a 20-pound fluorocarbon leader, that super fast action of that rod, that super heavy load on that rod, and how that rod is actually built is putting a lot of strain on a really small knot that could break loose and you could lose fish. And so for me, when it comes to casting gear and in big heavy applications with casting gear, I just don't trust braid to leaders a whole lot. Now, that being said, my buddy Chad Hoover fishes out of the kayak 24/7. I fish out of the kayak as well. He uses a lot of braid to leaders just because when you're fishing in a kayak, as soon as you hit a fish, you're going towards that fish, you're moving towards that fish, and you're kind of at an automatic disadvantage. And so he uses braid to leaders because even when he's using really heavy rods, a lot of the time the action of that rod, the load of that rod is immediately kind of taken away because he moves towards that fish when he sets the hook. And so for him, casting gear with braid to leaders works really well. But for me, fishing both in the boat and the kayak, I don't want to have different setups for the kayak that I do for the boat. And I've found that just the way I set the hook, fluorocarbon and straight mono on most casting applications does just fine for me. Now, there is a place where I do use braid to leaders, and that's on my spinning rods. And a lot of that has to do with it's lighter line. It's rods that just are built completely different. They're built a lot lighter. Most of my spinning rods are anywhere from 6/8 medium light to 7-foot medium. And so those rods are going to load a lot further down in the blank. They're going to have a lot more forgiveness. They're not going to load as fast. And obviously it's not heavy as applications in those scenarios. Most of my braid, I'm using like a 10 to 20 pound braided mainline to a 8 to 10 pound fluorocarbon leader. And I trust myself, I trust my knots, and I trust those applications in those scenarios just because, again, it's not as much stress on that rod, on that line, and I trust my knots are going to hold in those situations. Another thing that it does for me, it gives me extreme sensitivity. I mean, obviously braid is a lot more sensitive than any other material, and when you go from a fluorocarbon to a straight braid and that braid goes through the guides on that rod and you're already fishing a really light rod that's super sensitive, you're going to get a ton of sensitivity. And so in those really finesse situations where you're dragging a Ned rig, where you're dragging a shaky head and those fish are barely biting something, you get great translation down to that rod, down to your hand, and you're able to key in on even the subtlest of bites using those braid to fluorocarbon leaders. Now, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys use. Do you use braid to leader? You use straight braid? Do you use straight mono, straight fluorocarbon? I'd love to know. I mix it up with a bunch of different stuff, and I have a lot of success in doing that. And if you want to watch a video that I did about fishing line on this channel, click this video. It's popping up right here.